Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and a very warm welcome to you all. My name is Michael Wesley and I'm the Executive Director of the Lowy Institute. Welcome to you all to the 2011 Lowy Lecture, our flagship event. The Lowy Lecture provides a platform for a prominent speaker to reflect on how the world with which Australia interacts on an increasingly intense scale is evolving. It is an expression of the Lowy Institute's mission to analyse international affairs not just in terms of what's happening today, but in terms of what is about to loom over the horizon, to stimulate more extensive public consideration and discussion of the world and how it affects us among the other countries of the world, and to interrogate policy and provide clear, reasoned input into policy development. The Lowy Institute was established in 2003 to interrogate how the world impacts on a small open economy and society situated at the edge of the fastest developing region in human history, and to think about how Australia can and should respond. The Lowy Institute seeks to inspire new thinking and discussion about how the world, and in particular Asia, is changing, and often changing much faster than our perceptions can keep up. We're determined to go beyond the established and comfortable foreign affairs agenda, a realm inhabited largely by a small number of specialists, practitioners and academics, because today almost every part of our society is affected by and interacts with the world. The Lowy Institute also exists to influence policy agendas and decisions, particularly in the realms where governments have taken up on big hard thinking, have given up on big hard thinking, and universities have retreated into academic benchmarking. Over the past year, the big decisions Australia has grappled with have all had difficult international aspects. Whether it's a question of what to do about our greenhouse emissions, our terms of trade and exchange rate, or the shifting balance of power in our region, it's hard to escape the conclusion that the world is asking tougher and tougher questions of Australia. The past year has demonstrated emphatically that this country's need for independent centres of policy analysis, discussion and influence. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm aware that for a large number of you, about a third of our audience tonight, this is your first experience of the Lowy Institute. That's a fact about which I'm absolutely delighted. It means that we're doing what we've set out to do and reaching out to audiences that would not normally be interested in the usual foreign policy topics. It's also partly explained by our choice of speaker this evening, Mr. Lionel Barber, whose newspaper speaks to a range of issues far beyond the remit of narrow foreign affairs considerations. Nor would we associate normally with traditional international affairs some of our previous Lowy lecturers. The leader of Australia's largest scientific research organisation, Megan Clark, the CEO of the world's biggest mining company, Marius Kloppers, prominent environmental scientist Bob May, or former central bank chief Ian Macfarlane. And yet it doesn't take much imagination to realise how trends in innovation or the global resources trade or climate change or financial regulation shapes the world in which we live. This evening I'd like to thank our two event sponsors, Capital Group and Qantas, for making tonight's Lowy Lecture possible. Let me tell you briefly about how this evening will unfold. In a few moments' time, the entree will be served. After that, I'll be introducing Mr. Frank Lowy, the chairman of the Lowy Institute, to introduce our keynote speaker. After Mr. Barber's lecture, the main course will be served. Now, each table has on it a number of small note cards and pens on which people of that table can write a question for Mr. Barber as he speaks or perhaps afterwards. And these will be collected by our Lowy staff when the main course has been cleared. After the main course, Mr. Barber and I will return to the stage where I will ask him to respond to a range of audience questions, and during this time, dessert and coffee will be served. To conclude this evening's formalities, I will invite Mr. Michael Thorley, a Director of Capital Group, to propose a vote of thanks to Mr. Barber. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. Please do enjoy the meal and the lecture and the discussion. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, sorry to interrupt such rich conversations, but we now come to the central part of our evening. Ladies and gentlemen, the Lowy Institute wouldn't exist without the vision of one man, our chairman, Mr. Frank Lowy. The Lowy Institute he founded in 2003 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of his arrival in Australia. And the vision to have given a gift to create a think tank in Australia was, visionary. Australia is not well served by think tanks. If you look at countries that we compare ourselves to, even on a per capita basis, we have very few think tanks. And so for Frank Lowy to decide that he would leave a gift to the Australian nation of a think tank called the Lowy Institute, I think was a great piece of vision. So please join me in welcoming Frank Lowy to the podium to introduce our speaker this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This evening, we watch with concern events in Europe, wondering whether the mounting problems of sovereign debt in the Eurozone will pull the world into a double recession. For those of us in business, the economic problems faced by Europe and the United States do not appear insurmountable. I suppose it's easy for us to say. There are fairly clear and effective responses available. The real problem lies in the politics. In both Europe and the United States, there are deep disagreements not only over the causes of the problems, but over the preferred solutions. These disagreements raise questions over whether Europe and America can begin the process of economic recovery, or whether they are destined for their own lost decades in Japan. Meanwhile, the hopes for the world's economy rest in our own region. We look to the giant growing economies of China and India, and the rapidly emerging economies of Indonesia and Vietnam as the sources of dynamic in the world economy. Asia's economic rise has stimulated new patterns of strategic competition. It has started to reshape money markets and build new centers of research and innovation. This century will see Asia's internal dynamics shape those of the rest of the world. We in Australia need to understand and anticipate these major changes because we are closer to them and will be affected sooner than many other countries. This is the core of the Lowy Institute mission and purpose. Of course, at a time of rapid international change, different perspectives will greatly enrich our understandings. And so it is with great expectation that we wait to hear from the editor of one of the world's most prestigious financial newspaper, the Financial Times. Since Lionel Barber's appointment as editor of the Financial Times in November 2005, the paper has won numerous global awards for its quality journalism, including 3 Newspapers of the Year awards, which recognized the FT's role as a 21st century news organization. As editor, Mr. Barber has interviewed many of the world's leaders in business and politics. In 2001, he was named by European Voice as one of the 50 most influential personalities in Europe. Mr. Barber has co-written several books and has lectured widely on, on U.S. foreign policy, transatlantic relations, European security, and monetary union in the U.S. and Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our 2011 Lowy Lecturer, Mr. Lionel Barber.
Thank you, Mr. Lowy, for those generous remarks. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honour to deliver this year's Lowy Lecture. This is my first trip to Australia, and I am conscious that I'm following in the footsteps of distinguished visitors over the past week. Tiger Woods, President Obama, and others. Now, as an Englishman with an Irish grandfather, I'm wearing the right tie, who long dreamt of escaping down under, it's a bit of an embarrassing admission that it is my first trip. It's almost as embarrassing as a skipper being caught out for a golden duck. But I've already found so much to admire about this country. The weather. I really feel at home. But seriously, the majestic architecture here in Sydney, the sulphur-crested cockatoos of Katoomba, and the mystical beauty, which I saw this weekend firsthand at Uluru. That is the right pronunciation, I hope. Now, Donald Horne's barbed tribute to the lucky country has a special resonance today. Resource-rich Australia is enjoying the fruits of an extraordinary regional economic boom. Luck plays a little part in this chains to riches story, but you are also reaping the rewards of politically courageous decisions to curb public deficits and inflation more than 2 decades ago. Australia's good fortune is also to be part of an historic shift from west to east, driven largely by the rise of the once poor countries of China and India. This shift in economic power has aroused much soul-searching in Europe and the United States, even talk of a nation century, hence the mildly provocative title of my lecture tonight. Of course, the global financial crisis bears much of the blame. It was manufactured in the West and exported to the rest of the world, wreaking havoc with the public finances of the US and much of Europe. Western leaders have too often offered too little, too late. Western governments have either been held hostage by powerful interest groups or paralyzed by ideological division. In the US, Democrats have adopted the language of European class warfare, while Republicans, cowed by the Tea Party, are dedicated to the proposition of no new taxes under any circumstances. Ladies and gentlemen, not even Ronald Reagan said that. The paralysis of the West contrasts with activist leadership in the East, India perhaps being an exception. China has taken bold steps, first in 2008-9 to stimulate its economy, and Beijing has followed with an ambitious 5-year plan to transform the economy from export-dependent, investment-led growth to a model more conducive to bolstering wages and domestic consumer demand. So, here is the question. Will illiberal or authoritarian capitalism, at least in the short term, prove more effective than a deadlocked democratic system of checks and balances in the United States, or indeed the makeshift efforts to resolve the euro crisis amongst a group of 27 nation states? Now,
By historical standards, the supremacy of the West is a relatively recent phenomenon. It may prove relatively short-lived too. Professor Ian Morris of Stanford has identified two poles of civilization. The West, that is the civilizations that descended from the agricultural revolution in the so-called Fertile Crescent in today's Middle East, and the East, the civilizations that emerged from an independent revolution in part of what is now known as China. Until the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the West was slightly ahead. It subsequently fell behind until the 18th century, when it edged back again. Now, even allowing for the vagaries of state-sponsored statistics, the West appears once again to be lagging. For the first 3/4 of the 19th century, it was Britain which appeared as a colossus astride the world. Charles Darwin, visiting the thriving port of Sydney, wrote in January 1836, "My first feeling was to congratulate myself that I was born an Englishman." Darwin contrasted Sydney's bustling prosperity with the sedate former Spanish and Portuguese colonies which he'd just visited. These colonies, he concluded with some modesty, had barely advanced over the past 300 years. Britain's ascendancy was based on the native inventiveness of its people, the linked growth of manufacturing industry, and naval supremacy, which guaranteed access to markets and made the country's military a force to be reckoned with. Similarly, the rise of America as an imperial power may be traced back to February 1909 with the return of the Great White Fleet, that is, the 16 first-class battleships that President Teddy Roosevelt had dispatched on a 45,000-mile cruise around the world as a show of American power. America's intervention in 2 world wars, supported by the Australian imperial force, rescued Europe from the demons of nationalism and fascism. The US was also present at the creation of a new world order after 1945, based on liberal democracy and a new rules-based international system for diplomatic, monetary and trade affairs. And you're familiar with the institutions that underpin that system, such as the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the GATT, and the United Nations. And of course, those institutions largely reflected the preponderance of American power. Today, however, the post-war settlement is manifestly anachronistic. It no longer reflects the balance of economic power in the world. Europe, for example, is grossly overestimated. It is overestimated. It's overrepresented as well. Britain or France will not, of course, relinquish any time soon their status as members of the PERM 5 at the UN, but the economic imbalance has at least been partially recognised by a reweighting of power at the IMF, of voting power, as well as the creation of new international forum. And the most notable, of course, is the Group of 20, which brings in the rising powers of Brazil, as well as important regional players such as Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, and of course, Australia. Now, this adjustment is long overdue. While the G20 remains a fledgling body, it has the potential, I believe, to enhance its legitimacy and strengthen its capacity as a new institution of global governance. The pressing question for the West, at least, is how to maintain influence and power in an international system where that power is ebbing to new players. And this question is particularly acute for Europe. Now, it was Charles de Gaulle who once remarked of France, "How can you govern a country with 246 varieties of cheese?" All I can say is that it's a lot harder to govern a European Union of 27 different countries with even more types of cheeses, and, of course, a monetary union with fundamental flaws. Let's deal quickly with the economics. Operating a centralized monetary policy with residual national budgetary and economic policies has proven impossible. German policymakers suffer from a quasi-religious belief that fiscal deficits alone matter. In fact, external deficits have been shown to be a much greater guide to indiscipline, especially when residents have been spending more than their income and borrowing the rest from abroad. Europe's leaders have failed to convince financial markets that they can contain the crisis. After the last G20 meeting, an historic opportunity may have been missed. At best, Greece has bought time before the next aid package or a hard default. Europe's rescue fund, the EFSF, has admitted it cannot raise the promised funds through extra leverage. And the severe problems of adjustment for uncompetitive economies such as Greece and Portugal remain. The banking system remains fragile, economic growth is lacking, and the one institution which is capable of providing a credible backstop, that is the European Central Bank, cannot do so. And here we come to the politics. Now, as Marx said, that's Groucho, by the way, rather than Karl. Politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedies. I think that's true of the politics of the European Union and the Eurozone. It is at one level possible to sympathize with Germany because it gave up the Deutschmark and joined a monetary union where several other members were unwilling or incapable of staying the course. But Chancellor Angela Merkel's first instinct has been to treat all debtor countries as sinners, deserving Lutheran retribution before salvation through good works. Yet the surplus countries stand to lose far more if monetary union fails than in a bailout of Greece. And when President Sarkozy is not lecturing the British about their semi-detached status in Europe, he's fixated about losing the AAA credit rating, which could cost him next year's presidential election. But at least he is capable of recognizing political constraints in France and Germany. As he told Chancellor Merkel recently, "Vous avez un parlement très fort, mais un peuple très faible. Et moi, j'ai un parlement très faible, mais un peuple très fort." For those of you who don't speak French, I'll provide a translation later. In the space of a fortnight, the euro crisis has now claimed the scalps of two prime ministers, George Papandreou in Greece and Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. My goodness, how we'll miss him. Each of these have been replaced by technocrats. Monetary union, at least in southern Europe, is obviously too important to be kept to be the preserve of elected politicians. Now, my guess is that the euro will just about survive, but a new system of economic governance will have to be introduced to keep the monetary union intact. Membership may not be the same in 3 years' time or even less, given the Greek crisis. If Italy were to default, the game really would be up. But the euro focus, and this was alluded to earlier, does not begin to answer the real challenges facing a continent which suffers from an aging population, low growth, and hostility to immigration, and with some notable exceptions, is lagging in innovation. And when I raise these matters in visits to Berlin, Brussels, or Paris, I'm usually given a ticking off or a three-word riposte, the Lisbon Agenda. The Lisbon Agenda. Who can remember that? Well, it was summed up by the ambitious pledge to make Europe the most knowledge-capable, knowledge-intensive, and competitive economy in the world by 2020. Now, in retrospect, in my humble admission, Lisbon looks like an airy pledge made at the top of the dot-com bubble. And the burden of regulation is what we really need to focus on in areas such as the environment, employment law. These regulations have grown rather than been reversed. And while the sovereign debt crisis has forced countries such as Spain to dismantle labour market barriers, others cling to a model protecting insiders rather than young unemployed in search of a job. And yet without action, and that means rewriting Europe's social contract, and without decent growth rates, Europe is condemned to lose even further ground to Asia and to the United States. Turning to America, in their new book, Thomas Friedman and Michael Mandelbaum write that Americans are, quotes, getting only 50% of potential benefits from our first-rate system, whereas China is getting 90% of potential benefits from its second-rate political system. The diagnosis, as well as the book title, sounds glib, but the authors have put their finger on the institutional paralysis gripping America. This paralysis makes it doubly difficult to tackle long-term economic weaknesses obscured during the 2 decades of US hegemony after the end of the Cold War. The unipolar moment, to use Charles Krauthammer's term, flattered to deceive in 2 other important ways. It encouraged the military adventurism of President George W. Bush, and it fostered the notion that the free trade, deregulation-based American economic model, underpinned by fiscal discipline and easy monetary policy, that's the Rubin-Greenspan model, was for export to the rest of the world. It now turns out that America was selling flawed goods. Financial engineering, combined with cheap credit, almost brought down the world's banking system. We have come to understand that, aside from sky-high remuneration levels, the financial services industry is similar to the nuclear power industry. It is an essential utility, but one which requires close supervision. Nor has the American model responded well to the structural challenges facing its economy. Globalization has put virtually every American job under pressure. The information revolution has eliminated vast swathes of what were once deemed safe American jobs. The level of national debt and deficits crimp America's freedom of maneuver and impose an increasing burden on future generations. Declining income and rising inequality have been most acutely felt among the 70% of Americans who deem themselves to be middle class. The rise of the Tea Party, the anti-tax, anti-government activists, is not only a visceral response to federal government activism to tackle the Great Recession, it also reflects the genuine pain of a squeezed middle-class America. Political polarization has exacerbated the paralysis in Washington, highlighting the weaknesses of a system biased towards inaction. Yet the scale of the crisis does call for action. In earlier times, a decisive president, I'm thinking of Roosevelt, Truman, and Reagan come to mind, has galvanized the legislature by invoking a sense of crisis and capturing the public mood. President Obama, for all his rhetorical skills, has not managed to do that. Now, Tom Friedman fantasizes at one point in his book that if only we could have a dictator for the day in America. I pointed out to him in a recent conversation that dictators have a habit of sticking around longer than 24 hours. But whatever the conventional East Coast wisdom may say, the current paralysis does not necessarily spell a crisis of American governance. It's more tactical than structural. Let me explain briefly. In 2009, the White House understood that after the fall of Lehman Brothers, America faced the most serious financial crisis since the 1930s. The resulting economic downturn would be severe, but few predicted the financial repression, that is, prolonged credit squeeze and its impact on the broader economy. The best White House predictions were of a V-shaped recovery, a sharp rebound with job creation to follow. In this scenario, the White House could take out an insurance policy in terms of an economic stimulus, but shift its main focus to a once-in-a-generation reform of healthcare. The reform admittedly redeemed one of President Obama's main campaign pledges, but it was pushed through Congress on partisan lines, akin to a three-line whip. There was no serious attempt to reach across the aisle. Republicans may, of course, not have wished to embrace socialized medicine, but the White House and House Democrats have paid a heavy price for their partisan approach. Bill Clinton's adage about the primacy of the economy was ignored, and the resulting standoff, exacerbated now by the 2012 presidential campaign, means that pressing long-term issues such as social security reform are off the table. Now, there are some echoes with the 1970s after Watergate, but this stasis was broken by Ronald Reagan, who, for all his avowed conservatism, was capable of reaching across the aisle. He could strike bipartisan deals such as tax reform and pushing through a broader supply-side agenda. It would be short-sighted to rule out another strong executive leader breaking the Washington stalemate. But nobody should be under any illusion that action was required. If you look at the joint report Rising Above the Gathering Storm, produced by the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Science, and members of the National Research Council, in that report the authors identify the immediate threat to American preeminence. In a world where advanced knowledge is widespread and low-cost labor readily available, US advantages in the marketplace are and in science and technology are under threat. The authors call for an immediate effort to raise education standards in high school, boost investment in basic research, and ensure the US is the best place for top students, engineers, and scientists in the world. John Doerr, one of the foremost venture capitalists in America, was once asked to grade America in terms of research and development. Interestingly, he gave an A for information technology, a B/C for biotech, given the regulatory environment in the States, and a CD- for energy innovation in areas such as solar. As Doerr remarked, Americans spend more on potato chips than on energy technology research. And that's the reason many Americans, fear they're falling behind on innovation. And in political terms, this obviously translates into the commonly held view that the US is no longer operating on a level playing field. Authoritarian capitalism in countries such as China, they believe, hold therefore an unfair advantage. And of course, as we all know, and Americans really do love competition, as long as they're winning. So far, hostilities have been contained, though Congress is examining trade reprisals because of China's artificially low exchange rate. It would be tempting to seek to use this as a way of mobilizing public opinion against an external threat. This happened with the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, and less justifiably with Japan in the late 1980s. The question I would ask tonight is, how sustainable is the Chinese model anyway? Now, Chairman Mao famously exhorted people to focus on contradictions because every contradiction, he said, conceals a truth. The problem in China today is that there are so many contradictions, it really is hard to know where to start looking. The country is a blur of social, historical, economic, geographical, and political incongruities, most of which either derive from or are related to a single overarching paradox. China is 3 decades into running a diverse capitalist economy with a single-party hierarchy. So far, the model of state capitalism has been wildly successful, but strains and stresses in the system are becoming increasingly apparent. Now, perhaps more so perhaps than at any time since the era of reform and opening began in late 1978, it's pertinent to ask whether China can continue to forge ahead with its current economic and political model. Before examining these contradictions, and these facts will be familiar to this audience, it's worth just stating a few things. China is already the second largest economy in the world. It has the world's largest current account surplus and the biggest holding of foreign currency reserves, a mere $3.2 trillion. It's the world's largest exporter and the second largest importer after the United States, especially of raw material and energy. And yet, China's gross domestic product per head at purchasing power parity is still only about 1/5 of the United States. This was Japan's relative position back in 1950, before more than 2 decades of extremely rapid growth. As my colleague Martin Wolf has pointed out, China is set to become an economic superpower while still a developing country. It is, to coin a phrase, the premature superpower. And I think this is the essential background to Beijing's latest 5-year plan, which recognizes that the investment-driven export-led model is no longer, or is less and less sustainable. Fixed asset investment, remember, now contributes more than 50% of GDP growth, and the efficiency of that investment is declining rapidly, as you can see in areas such as the railways, road toll expressways, and other infrastructure. Now, these stark infrastructure problems do not mean that the Chinese edifice is about to come tumbling down. Beijing still has plentiful fiscal resources and capital markets to tap. But they do mean that the current investment-heavy model is nearing the end of its time. There is a need, again, as the 5-year plan explains, to boost consumer spending and to develop the service sector. But that's easier said than done. Remember, Japan made that promise 2 decades ago, and it's still not achieved it. The first impediment is that much of China's success has been built upon the involuntary sacrifices of the consumer. State banks have kept interest rates artificially low, penalizing savers in order to preserve minimal borrowing costs for corporations. If this trade-off is now reversed, then the big state-run companies, which form the bulwark of the Communist Party's economic power, would suddenly be disadvantaged. And other aspects of the state capitalist system are also showing signs of strain. China keeps electricity prices artificially low by mandating a state price for thermal coal. But coal miners chafe at having to sell their produce to power stations at far below the prices they would get by selling it on the free market. So every summer, when air conditioners are turned up across the country, the coal mines restrict supply of thermal coal, just when power stations need it most. Sudden power cuts introduce people in a very palpable sense to the heat produced by China's systematic contradictions. Another cornerstone of the model is crumbling. After 30 years of abundant cheap labor, there is now an absolute shortage of migrant workers in the big factory towns along the east and south coasts. Migrant worker wages have climbed by around 30% this year compared to last, meaning that many low-tax manufacturers have had to relocate to cheaper locations inland or move overseas. And with the boom in rural China reinforcing a growing reluctance among rural workers to migrate, the trend of rising manufacturing costs is likely to continue, hitting China's competitiveness, although the response is likely to move up the value chain. Now, as China embarks on the convulsive shift from low-cost manufacturing champion to a more consumer-friendly economy, the impact will be felt well beyond China's borders. The most obvious impact will be via the outward reach of China Inc. Propelled by waning competitiveness at home, China's manufacturers are scouring the world, searching for markets, acquiring companies, upgrading technology, and building brands. The era of Chinese offshoring is upon us and is likely to last for several decades. As Gerald Lyons, chief economist of Standard Chartered Bank, has observed, the sense that everything is made in China may give way to a perception that everywhere is owned by China, though of course that may take a good while. Still, the key destinations are coming into focus for this new activity: Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico, South Africa, even the United States. And what distinguishes China's internationalization from that of Japan is the speed and scale of the change. This year, too, a few unheralded spectacles have emerged. Chinese savers have withdrawn their money in droves from the big state banks, where the interest they earn falls woefully short of inflation, and they've deposited them in shadow banks where they can earn a real return. The hemorrhage has been so large that the shadow banking system, which exists beyond regulatory remit, now extends more credit every month than the official banks do. There are other signs of shifting. The rise of Sina Weibo, China's version of Twitter, has punched a big hole in the party's propaganda control. Some 200 million Chinese citizens now air opinions on events at home and overseas in real time, and the sheer volume of comments is so large that the censors cannot keep up. So what we are seeing is fundamental contradictions in the Chinese political economic model. And in the past, with the exception, of course, of Tiananmen Square, the Chinese elite have proved exceptionally adept in modifying their model without surrendering controls of the lever of power. Their legitimacy has also rested on the mantra of delivering ever-improving living standards. So, just as there is soul-searching in the West, there's also soul-searching amongst those in charge of China's body politic. Recently, Premier Wen Jiabao spoke of 5 priorities for reform, including separating the functions of the party and government to prevent an over-concentration of power, creating an independent judiciary, fighting corruption, promoting social justice, etc. Well, that's not going to happen anytime soon, but it's interesting that he articulated that need. But even if there isn't change, the question is, what kind of China is going to bestride the world? Is it going to remain a nation apart, starkly different in character from the capitalist democracies around it, and driven by unreconciled domestic contradictions? And this leads to my conclusion. Now, I've concentrated a great deal on China, not because other countries are marginal, but just because China is not, if not the elephant in the room, certainly the elephant in the region. China's rise, when measured in terms of higher living standards for a long-suffering population, should draw admiration and respect, but it should not be a matter for euphoria. China's rise is likely to have far-reaching consequences in terms of economics and geopolitics, which in turn require deft statesmanship. Throughout the age, the failure to accommodate rising powers, or rather, the failure of rising powers to accommodate the existing state system, has been a source of conflict. Germany's search for a place in the sun at the end of the 19th century is one example. Resource-hungry Japan's quest for a co-prosperity sphere in the interwar period is another, and less obvious but no less relevant is, of course, America's rise as an imperial power in the late 19th century, which caused conflict not just here in the Pacific, but also in the Caribbean. In the case of China, it is vital that all interested parties grasp the mutual interest in upholding and developing, rather than overturning, the rules-based system built up after World War II. Of course, the West, principally the United States, will have to adjust to accommodate China. But China will have to accommodate too, in particular in the fields of finance, money, trade, and direct investment and energy. In the coming years, this will have to cover the liberalization of the banking system, the outflow of official capital resulting from massive intervention to support the yuan and ensuring sterilization, and the ensuing sterilization, and the future convertibility of the RMB. though that prospect is, of course, not immediate. It will also have to cover intellectual property and foreign and direct investment. In the same spirit, China has an interest in pursuing policies which are both consistent with protecting its own interests and the international order. It is troubling, therefore, to note the number of territorial disputes which China is involved with in the neighborhood. These include spats with Japan, the Philippines, and Vietnam, as well as the protracted standoffs with India and Taiwan. As Chinese power grows and its blue water naval capability and missile capability expands, and the search for security of supply for natural resources intensifies, the risks of tensions escalating are obvious. It cannot be stressed enough that China's interest is to preserve the stability which is the best guarantee that Beijing can continue to deliver the increasing levels of prosperity shared by its people. And in this sense and spirit, I would judge that the announcement this week of the expanded or the semi-permanent marine presence in the Northern Territories and associated other measures is a judicious hedge, as long as it is not the first building block in a containment strategy and is more fitted to, if you like, a concert of powers of allies in dealing with security issues in the region. I think that is all to the good. So, ladies and gentlemen, if this is to be an Asian century, what does this mean for Australia? Well, to paraphrase former British Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd, Australia really does punch above its weight. You can call on long-standing cultural and familial ties with Britain and Europe. You work closely with the United States in economic and security matters. But you're also linked closely to the Asian region, especially China. You might even be characterized as the West's early warning system in Asia. Australia is also an active player in the G20, bridging developing countries and developed countries. You can speak as an advocate of free trade, but also as a critical supplier of natural resources. You have every right to be seen as a strong country committed to the region, but also as an aspiring global player. Asia's rise should therefore be a source of encouragement, even if the West's present travails will cause trepidation. History, of course, rarely travels in straight lines. The rise and fall of nations is no exception. In the case of America, decline is at worst relative. Europe, and I suppose I mean EU Europe, its problems are very serious, especially in terms of its aspirations as an international actor and in terms of its competitiveness. The rise of China, the premature superpower, does seem assured. But this is not, and nor should it be, a zero-sum game. China's great test is to achieve a balance between rapid development at home and stability abroad. Australia and the rest of the world have a huge stake in the outcome. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you'll all agree that we've just heard a very rich and a very well-crafted tour d'horizon about the state of the world we're living in and how it's changing. We're now going to serve our main course. We're going to give Lionel Barber exactly 15 minutes to eat as much as he can before he and I are going to come back on stage and have a discussion. Let me all remind you that each table does have note cards on it on which you can record your questions. Please do take that opportunity, and Lowy staff will be coming around in approximately 10 minutes to collect those questions. Please enjoy your main course. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now ready to have a bit of a discussion to follow on from the lecture. Lionel, why don't you... Now, I've got, I think, enough questions. I think everyone in the room has written down 2 questions, so this should only take us about another 6 hours or so. So settle in. No, actually, we've only got about 25 minutes. So, Lionel Barber, let me start off with, there's a lot of questions here about Europe and some real scenarios. A lot of them focusing around what Germany might do. Might Germany pull out of, eventually give up, pull out of the euro and go its own way? What would be the results from that? And in particular, quite an interesting one, what are the prospects for hyperinflation in Europe of the sort we saw in the 1920s that would lead to the rise of unelected leaders in some of Europe's biggest countries?
Well, we've got 2 unelected leaders right now in Greece with the former central bank governor and Super Mario Monti in Italy. So it's already happening. But to be serious, hyperinflation is not the problem at the moment. Deflation is still the problem. And I don't see, to paraphrase again Marx, that is Karl, not Groucho, history repeats itself first to tragedy and then as farce. And we aren't going to see a repeat of the 1920s, 1930s. I think lessons have been learnt, not least about the conduct of monetary policy and fiscal policy. And no German, every German knows very well what happened in the 1930s, even the current one.
A number of people asked, you talked a lot about China in your presentation. What about the other parts of Asia? What are your feelings about India in particular? That was a big theme of the questions, but other parts of Asia as well. What about Southeast Asia also?
Yeah. Just a word on India. I spent 8 days just about a year ago in India, and my sense was that the great benefits of the reforms, the kind of reforms which were introduced here in this country, and there was similarly under Manmohan Singh as finance minister 20 years ago, that reform impetus is somewhat ebbed. There's kind of reform fatigue, and there's a bit of a backlash against not just the oligarchs, the big billionaires, but in general. And so India, despite its impressive growth rate, is faltering a little bit and is certainly lagging behind China. As to the rest of Southeast Asia, I think I just refer to what I said in the speech, which is China's influence is growing in terms of impact on the supply chains, and it's pulling other countries with it. And I think countries like Vietnam are definitely ones to watch in the next 5 years. And elsewhere, when I talked about wage costs rising in China, as a result, China is investing in lower cost countries such as Bangladesh, another one to watch.
Now, in your speech you talked a lot about some of the problems that China is facing in the near term. A lot of people want you to make an ultimate prediction about China. Will all of these systematic or systemic contradictions lead to an ultimate stalling of China? Will China become trapped in that middle income trap? What is your outlook for China?
Well, I hesitate to appear before you as an informed POM on China, because the fact is that probably more than 60-70% of people in this room know much more about China than I do. But I would be cautious about assuming that this machine really does stall and fizzle. I think that there is a tremendous impetus behind economic reform, economic growth, because that is the one thing on which legitimacy rests. I also think, China, it's a bit like Hungarians. They're fine until you talk about the Croats, or the Romanians, or and China, they're just lovely people until you start talking about Tibet. And what I mean by that is that there is this great sense, too, of territorial integrity and keeping things together. And if you talk to the senior Chinese businessmen and politicians and technocrats, you understand this fear of instability. I will never forget being in the first visit I made to China in 1999, and I was put in the Henry Kissinger seat, with right next to this tiny lady who was the governor of the Central Bank of Shanghai. And I decided to be really clever and quote Zhu Rongji about staring into the abyss and charging through it. And I said, and I'm therefore confident that China, just like Margaret Thatcher, and just the mere mention of Margaret Thatcher, this lady's eyes, yes, inspiration. And I said that this country is not for turning. There is no alternative. And she said to me, through a translator, yes, China has formidable problems, but at least not such a formidable problem as the Great Famine of 1961. And that's fairly sobering. And they talk about the Cultural Revolution. They don't want to go through that again.
Now, there's a very interesting question here about whether China can innovate. China has been the factory of the world. It has been the point of final manufacture. Can China find, obviously with all of the IP issues involved as well, has China got what it takes to become an innovative leader at the forefront of global production?
Well, it's certainly a leader in the business of copying. They're great copiers. And I think that one of the things that is going to hold back China is the fact it simply doesn't have the high-quality education system, higher education system, as example, by comparison with the United States. They are sending, and it's notable how many members of the Chinese elite, the princelings and the princelings' sons and daughters, are being educated at universities in the United States. But if you think about it, those universities, part of the reason why they are so successful is that there is the free spirit of research and inquiry. And although China is not a full-on totalitarian state, there are limits to free speech and freedom of expression. And that ultimately is definitely going to hold China back, and it may ultimately lead to even more strains and stresses in the system.
With long periods ahead of low growth in Europe, the United States, other parts of the developed world, obviously the world is looking to Asia as the growth engine, the growth dynamo. Aren't we all, to some extent, invested in China's economic success? And as a flip side to that question, what happens to the world economy if China does significantly slow?
Well, as they say in Newcastle, we're buggered. That's Newcastle, England, by the way, not New South Wales. We know they speak much better English there. No, it's dangerous to be too reliant. I mean, remember, just 10 years ago, we were still talking about America being the country, the consumer of last resort, the engine of growth in the world. And it would be a great mistake to write off America. In fact, it would be dangerous to do so. We want different poles of economic growth. And Europe, for all its failings, there's great potential. If you look at Italy, actually, if they only took a few measures for significant economic reform, there's great potential in that country. The question is whether the politics work. But right now, if China really were to slow down and I say I'm dubious about statistics, but have a real slowdown, that would have a profound impact on this country and elsewhere.
What about the United States? Is the United States too big to fail? Will it be permitted, for instance, to monetarily print its way out of trouble?
It already is. It already is. The credit downgrade was a big shock in Washington. Even the most pachyderm-like politician in Washington noticed the downgrade, and it hurt. But overall, if you look at bond yields and you look at the credit rating, even though America has this enormous national debt, and even though Admiral Mullen, the outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said it was that the level of national debt was the greatest threat to national security in the United States, despite all that, they are still carrying on. And, I think they've still got some room, but the room for maneuver is diminishing. And if you read, I had a long chat with him in Washington in my last visit, Congressman Paul Ryan. If you read that report on the budget deficit and the need for spending curbs to get these social security and other benefits under control, you can see that it's not infinite. The world's patience is not infinite.
Now, there's a lot of questions here basically asking for advice for our Prime Minister.
Oh dear.
So in the role of the the expert POM.
Yeah. Yes.
There are a number of
pontificating POM. If I'm actually going to give advice, yes. What on earth makes you think that she wants advice from moi?
Let's just construct that scenario. You're on the plane that's taking her to Bali this week. You've got 10 minutes with her. A lot of people are asking, did she make the right call this week?
Yeah.
In terms of doubling down on the US alliance, in terms of the rhetoric around China, did she make the right call this week?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm just a journalist, all power, no responsibility. So I don't give advice at all, and if I do, I certainly charge for it. But I think I'd offer two pieces of advice. One is, for Christ's sake, stop looking so doe-eyed in front of the president. That's off the record. This POM can bite. No, that was a joke, and I don't want that repeated. This is off the record, isn't it? This is deep background.
Parts of it. You just don't know which parts.
No, on a more serious, I think that that's trivial. Okay, things are captured on camera. It's not substantive, and as I suggested, the agreement that was struck this week between the United States and the Australian government was judicious. There is no question that Australia relies on America as its closest military ally and for its security. You have a mutual defense treaty. You've had it for 50 years. So that's where you are. But you're also going to play a portfolio. And you have your security portfolio and you have your economic portfolio. And as long as you keep those in balance, that's sensible policy. And the second point is, as long as you don't, let's spell this out, as long as you don't, and you didn't, agree to offer a sovereign base a la Guam or Okinawa to the Americans, you've given yourself room for maneuver. So I think that this was a judicious and sensible move, and I applaud the Prime Minister for doing it.
Now, if the Chinese do get cranky about this...
I'm really scared now. If anybody in the Sydney Morning Herald puts that in, I am going to be so pissed. Sorry.
I'll try and get you into even more trouble.
Yeah.
if China chooses to...
Or if they do, they can put the rest of the stuff that I said. Anyway, go on.
If China does get cranky about this, China is our biggest customer of iron ore. It's our biggest export customer. But on the other hand, we are the biggest supplier of essential minerals to China. Where does the balance lie? Who has the more power in the relationship?
Well, right now you have you hold most of the cards as the supplier. But the question you have to ask yourselves, and again I owe this to a conversation that I had in Melbourne yesterday with somebody who knows much more about energy supplies than I do, that this isn't going to last forever. So you need to think about where will you be in 5 to 7 years' time? What are the alternative sources of supply for the Chinese? And I'm thinking particularly of Africa. And maybe you should think that the good times, as they say in New Orleans, don't roll forever. So what are you doing now to take difficult decisions to get yourself in a good place in 5 years' time? And maybe the Prime Minister, the politicians, and I don't give advice to the financial, I leave it to Martin Wolf. This is the question you have to do. You've never had it so good, as Harold Macmillan once said. So what are you doing now to make sure that, when the good times stop, that you've got your options?
Now, last week, the Australian Parliament passed legislation for a carbon tax in Australia. A lot of people have asked here, is this a good move? Is this the right thing for Australia to have done? Is this the best way to attack this problem?
Enlightened unilateralism. It's if you believe that climate change is a serious issue, and you want, even if you don't believe all the science, but you don't think it's 100% persuasive, but you want to hedge, then introducing a carbon tax is probably a wise move. But it would be a whole lot better if you could get other countries to come along with you.
Now, if this is the Asian century, and Australia increasingly trades with Asia, it increasingly invests in Asia, where does this leave our relations long term with the United States, the UK and Europe?
Well, I believe the ties that bind and that I've alluded to in terms of security will remain strong with the United States. I hope that the ties with Europe, and particularly Britain, remain strong. I think there's a great mutual heritage, and which stretches way beyond cricket rivalry. And I think that, again, if one should talk about portfolio management, maybe one portfolio will become more important, but that doesn't mean to say that you discard the others or one of the others. And Europe is going through great difficulties now, but Europe is still, it's not a museum. And there is still potential there. There's still growth. And we haven't talked about Britain, and I'm not here to sell Britain to this community, but don't write Britain off. I mean, we're not in the euro.
Well,
and we've got a financial centre, and it's more important than Frankfurt, and it's certainly more important than Paris. And we have a more flexible labour market. There's a few problems there, but we're still benefiting from the changes that were introduced more than 20 years ago. And when people said that if there was a hung parliament, the bond market would crash, not true. We've got also the most credible economic management of the budget than any other state in Western Europe. And I just want to say a word about the riots, which were appalling in terms of television. And I said this to the Chinese Vice Premier, and I think he understood. I said this was pure criminality. And because they like history, I said, Mr. Premier, Vice Premier, the fact is that Napoleon described Britain as a nation of shopkeepers. Now we know that Britain is a nation of shoppers, or maybe shoplifters. So things have changed. But we're open for business, literally.
Now, we've got some pretty avid FT readers in the room, and one of them has reminded us that the FT actually urged Britain to join the euro.
No, it didn't.
Are you pleased that didn't happen?
No, it certainly didn't. And I was actually in Brussels at the time, and I read the leader, and I wasn't responsible for writing it. We were unequivocally in favour of the euro. But what was astonishing about this leader, which went on for a whole page, was that it only mentioned the word economics about 2/3 towards the end. It was all about politics. And of course that was the way it was seen. And that was what Mr. Tony Blair, how he saw monetary union. He wanted Britain to join for political reasons, not economic reasons. And a few of us did not share that view. And one of the first things I did when I was editor was to say, through clenched teeth, that one thing Gordon Brown had got absolutely right was being against Britain joining the euro.
Now, does the economic sense of not joining the euro consign Britain politically to the second tier of Europe? Will there be this renewed Franco-German axis in the middle and Britain on the outer?
Well, I remember again when I was in Brussels attending a ministerial meeting, and you may have heard in this room of Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Yes. And I remember Gordon Brown being so furious because he'd been left out of the core meeting with all the countries that were about to join the euro. And I remember Strauss-Kahn saying, I won't do it in French, but essentially it was, hey, listen, if someone has just got married, they don't, and they go on a honeymoon, they don't invite strangers into the bedroom. Well, Dominic, well, you know. But to be serious for a moment, I also remember them saying that if we were left out, we'd be left dining with the Greeks. Thank God we're not. But there is a risk of it going to a two-tier Europe. Mr. Cameron David Cameron, the Prime Minister, is well aware of it, and I'm afraid his slogan, or George Osborne's slogan, is, well, Britain is going to be the leader of the outs, doesn't really have a resonant ring, does it? Leader of the outs. Well, actually, as I said to him, the problem is that many of the outs actually want to get in. So where does that leave you? Dining with the Greeks, because they'll soon be out. But anyway.
Now, at the Lowy Institute, our definition of Asia includes the entire continent of Asia, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific.
That's a generous geographical definition.
So I guess one of the final left-of-centre questions, if you like, is about the Arab Spring. How significant an event for Asia's rise, for the world, is the Arab Spring? How widespread will it be? How long will it go on? Will it affect China? How will it affect, ultimately, the balance between West and East?
Well, we don't know yet, but we do know that this is an historic convulsion. It's as important as 1989 in the region, and it has not played out, definitely not. And I think you can see that from the events in Syria. It is not obvious which way these countries will go. They're not going to be fully fledged democracies overnight, of course not, but there's still the prospect of giving people who lived in despair and indignity a chance. And I think one of the places to watch is not all the attention that's been foisted on Libya is disproportional, because the really key country is Egypt. One way of thinking about this is, if you compare it to Europe, Egypt is Germany and Libya is Denmark with a bit of oil. And so I think that's really, really important. I also think that there are still very serious security problems. We don't know what's going to happen with Iran and its nuclear weapons program, because it is a nuclear weapons program. It's a very unstable region. But in the end, history's verdict will be that 2011 marked a step forward for the Arab world and the Middle East region, and it put to bed the notion that Arabs somehow had no interest in democracy.
Okay, I'm going to finish up with a very practical question. Given the success of your various digital editions and the relatively low cost of creating local editions, are you planning to produce an Australian digital edition of the FT in digital format?
Well, that all depends on the advertising. We'll look at it. I mean, you've got a bit of competition from, isn't it funny, we're back to the G20. We have an India homepage. Brazil we're looking at. But, Australia's increasing importance will warrant close attention. And I think the digital edition, we have now 250,000 plus subscribers. It's growing rapidly. The mobile content is the future. The print is worth protecting because it's still an important source of advertising. But, we are walking and chewing gum at the same time. We believe in print and digital, and I'll take a look at it. Thank you.
Well, Lionel Barber, as usual, the discussion period is often much more enlightening. Well, not much more, but more enlightening and spontaneous part of the evening. I'd like now to call on Michael Thorley, a Director of Capital Group, and more importantly, a Director of the Lowy Institute, to come and propose a vote of thanks to Lionel Barber. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. By some quirk of fate, this is the third time that I have been at a meeting or an event and listened to Lionel in 6 months in 3 different continents. And I'm beginning to feel he's like an opera star travelling around, and I'm one of his sort of groupie fans that is trailing around after him. But on each occasion, it's been both very stimulating and informative, and also extremely entertaining. And thinking tonight, as he was speaking about all of the problems that we face, it really is a daunting set of challenges that he spoke about in Europe, the United States and China. But the thought which kept on coming back to me, and as he himself said, the place which is indeed very fortunate is Australia. And to me, the message I will go away with tonight is, despite all of these challenges, what a phenomenal opportunity Australia has with its political strengths, its economic strengths, and its relationships and alliances around the world. And of course, this is where the Lowy Institute can play a very important role, and I'm sure that under the leadership of Michael Wesley it will continue to do so. It remains really for me just to say, on behalf of Frank Lowy, our chairman, and my fellow directors of the Lowy Institute, and all of you here tonight, thank you to Lionel for a very stimulating, entertaining evening, and to ask you to join with me in showing our appreciation of his time here.